Chapter 23. Anset's face was stiff when he awoke. He was not cold anymore. His head ached, and where the splinters had been driven into his face, the stinging was a constant undercurrent. But he felt something cool touching his face, and wherever it touched, the stinging went away. He opened his eyes just a little. Este leaned over him, dabbing salve onto his face. For the moment, Anset forgot everything bad and carefully said to her, "I didn't jump. They told me to jump and I didn't." She said nothing. She said nothing at all, nothing at all, and her silence was a blow that knocked him back in on himself, and his struggle returned. The water was rushing up to meet him, a vast whirlpool sweeping higher and higher, and Anset was at the top, and there was nowhere higher that he could go to escape. He looked inside himself, and there was no escape, and as the water touched him, swept his feet out from under him, bore him in fast, dizzying circles around and around, he screamed. His scream was a voice that filled the high room and echoed from the walls and shattered the stillness of the mist outside. He was no longer in the high room. He was being sucked down into the maelstrom. The water closed over his head, spinning faster and faster as he plunged deeper and deeper toward the mouths of the waiting terrors below. One after another they swallowed him up. He felt himself being swallowed, the massive peristalsis driving him into gullet after gullet, hot, warm places where he could not breathe. And he was walking into a room, walking and walking, but getting no farther into the room than he had been before, and all alone, no other sound. He heard the song he had been searching for, heard the song and saw the singer, but could not hear and could not see, not really, because the singer had no face that he could recognize. And the song, no matter how carefully he listened, kept escaping the moment after he heard it. He could not hear the melody in his memory, only in the moment, and as he looked at an eye, the other eye vanished, and when he looked for the mouth, the eye he had seen before disappeared. He was no longer walking, though he had no memory of reaching the woman who lay on the bed. He reached out. He was touching her face. He was stroking her face so very gently, tracing the features, the eyes, the mouth, and the voice sang, "Bye, lo, bye, bye, lo, bye." But the moment he understood the words, he lost them, and the mist came up and swallowed his face. He clutched for it, held it tight. She could not disappear from him in the mist, which was all white, invisible faces that swallowed her up. This time he held on tightly, and he would not let go. Nothing could pull him away. He heard the song again. Heard the song, and it was exactly the same song. And this time the words were, "I will never hurt you. I will always help you. If you are hungry, I'll give you my food. If you are frightened, I am your friend. I love you now, and love does not end." He knew where he was now. Somehow he had been pulled from the lake. He lay on the shore of the lake, and he was dry and safe, and the song he had been searching for had at last been found. He still gripped the face tightly, clinging to the hair, holding the face close over his own as he lay there, and he knew her at last, and cried for joy. Chapter 24. Anset lay across Este's lap, his hands frantically gripping her hair, when at last his violent shaking stopped, and his jaw slackly opened, and his eyes at last focused, and he saw her. "Mama!" he cried, and there was no song but childhood in his voice. Este opened her mouth, and tears poured from her eyes and flew as she blinked to Anset's cheeks, and she sang from the deepest part of her heart, "Anset, my only son." He wept and clung to her, and she babbled meaningless words to him, sang her most soothing songs to him, and held him tightly. They lay on the blankets in the warm high room as the storm raged outside. As she held his bruised and cut face into her shoulder, she also wept, for 2 hidden places had been plumbed, and she did not know or care which had been the greater achievement. She had locked him into silence in the high room in order to cure him. He had returned the favor, and she, too, was healed. Chapter 25. It was the afternoon of the 14th day. Sunlight streamed through the cracks on the western shutters. Anset and Este sat on the floor of the high room, singing to each other. Anset's song was halting, though the melody was high and fine, and his words were all the agony of loss and loneliness as he grew up. But the agony had been transformed, was transformed even as he sang, by the harmony and counter-melody of Este's wordless song, which said not to fear, not to fear, not to fear. Anset's hands danced as he sang, playing gently along Este's arms, face, and shoulders, kept capturing her hands and letting them go. His face was alight as he sang, the eyes were alive, and his body said as much as his voice did, for while his voice spoke of the memory of fear, his body spoke of the presence of love. Chapter 26. Richter's Ashen was not sure what to do. Mikal had been emphatic. The songbird was to return with Richter's Ashen, and yet Richter's knew that he could not achieve anything by blustering or threatening. This was not a national council or a vain dictator on an unsophisticated planet where the Emperor's very name could inspire terror. This was the Songhouse, and it was older than the Empire, older than many worlds, older than any government in the galaxy. It recognized no nationality, no authority, no purpose except its songs. Richter's could only wait, knowing that delay would infuriate Mikal, and knowing that haste would accomplish nothing in the Songhouse. At least the Songhouse was taking him seriously enough that they left a full-fledged Songmaster with him, a man named On, whose every word was reassurance, though in fact he promised nothing at all. "We're honored to have you here," On said. "You must be," Richter's answered, amused. "This is the third time you said so." "Well, you know how it is," On said with good cheer. "I meet so few outsiders that I hardly know what to say. You'd hardly enjoy hearing the gossip of the Songhouse, and that's all I know to talk about." "You'd be surprised at how much interest I'd have in gossip." "Oh no, we have singularly boring gossip," On said, and then changed the subject to the weather, which had been alternately rainy and sunny for days. Richter's grew impatient. Weather mattered a great deal, he supposed, to the planet-bound. To Richter's Ashen, weather of any kind was just one more reason to be in space. The door opened, and Este herself entered, accompanied by a boy. Blonde and beautiful, Richter's recognized him instantly as Ansett, Mikal's songbird, and almost said so. Then he hesitated. The boy looked different somehow. He looked closely. There were scratches and bruises on his face. "What have you been doing to the boy?" asked Richter's, appalled at the thought that the child might have been beaten. It was Ansett himself who answered, in tones that inspired absolute confidence. "The boy could not lie," said his voice. "I fell on the woodpile. I knew better than to play there. I was lucky not to break a bone." Richter's relaxed, and then realized another, more important reason why the child looked different. He was smiling. His face was alert. His eyes looked warm and friendly. He held Este's hand. "Are you ready to come with me?" Richter's asked him. Ansett smiled and sighed, and both melted Richter's normal reserve. He liked the boy immediately. "I wish I could come," Ansett said, "but I'm a songbird, and that means that I must sing to the whole Songhouse before I go." Ansett turned to Este. "May I invite him to attend?" Este smiled, and that surprised Richter's more than the change in Ansett. He hadn't thought the woman knew how to seem anything but stern. "Will you come?" Ansett asked. "Now?" "Yes, if you like." And Ansett and Este turned and left. Richter's, unsure of himself, looked at On, who blandly returned his gaze. "I was invited," Richter's decided, "and so I can follow them." They led him to a large hall, which was filled with hundreds and hundreds of children who sat on hard benches in absolute silence. Even their bare feet on the stone made little noise as the last of them filed into place. Scattered among them were many teenagers and adults, and on the stone platform at the front of the hall sat the oldest of them. They were all dressed alike, in the drab robes that reached to the floor, though none of the children seemed to have clothing that exactly fit. The impression was of poverty until he looked at their faces, which looked exalted. Este and Ansett led him to the rear of the hall, at the end of the center aisle. Richter's was surprised to have been given such a poor seat. He did not know, and no one at the Songhouse ever told him, that he was the first outsider in centuries to witness a ceremony in the great hall of the Songhouse. He did not even know it was a ceremony. Ansett and Este merely walked, hand in hand, to the front of the hall. Este stepped onto the platform, then reached down a hand to bring Ansett up. Then the Songmaster retired to a chair on the platform, while Ansett stood alone in front, at the head of the aisle, where Richter's could see him clearly. And he sang. His voice filled every part of the hall, but there was no resonance from the walls to distort the tone. He rarely sang words, and those he sang seemed meaningless to Richter's. Yet the Emperor's envoy was held spellbound. Ansett's hands moved in the air, rising, falling, keeping time with odd rhythms in the music. His face also spoke with the song, so that even Richter's, at a distance, could see that the song came from Anset's soul. No one in the hall wept, not even the youngest groans with the least control. Control was not threatened by Anset's song, and it did not reflect the feelings of the audience. Indeed, the song divided the audience into every separate individual, for Anset's song was so private that no two people could hear it the same way. The song made Richter's think of plunging down between planets, though the child could not possibly have experienced a pilot's thrill of vertigo. And when Anset at last fell silent, the song lingered in the air, and Richter's knew he would never forget it. He had shed no tears, felt no terrible passions, yet the song was one of the most powerful experiences of his life. McCall has waited a lifetime for this, Richter thought. All the children and adults in the hall rose, though he had seen no cue given, and all of them began to sing, one by one, then all together, until the sheer weight of sound made the air in the hall feel thick and aromatic with melody. They were saying goodbye to Anset, who alone was silent, who stood without weeping on the platform. They were still singing as Anset stepped from the platform, and without looking to the left or the right, walked down the aisle to where Richter's waited. Anset held out his hand. Richter's took it. "Take me with you," Anset said. "I'm ready to go." And Richter's hand trembled as he led Anset from the hall, as he took him to the Flesket waiting outside that would carry them both to Richter's starship. Richter's had seen wealth, had seen the opulence of Mikhail's palace at Susquehanna, had seen the 1,000 most beautiful things that people made and bought and sold. None of them was worth the beauty that walked beside him, that held his hand, that smiled at him as the songhouse door closed behind them. And his struggle returned. The water was rushing up to meet him, a vast whirlpool sweeping higher, and Anset was at the top, and there was nowhere higher that he could go to escape. He looked inside himself, and there was no escape, and as the water touched him, swept his feet out from under him, bore him in vast, dizzying circles around and around, he screamed. His scream was a voice that filled the high room and echoed from the walls and shattered the stillness of the mist outside. He was no longer in the high room. He was being sucked down into the maelstrom. The water closed over his head, spinning faster and faster as he plunged deeper and deeper toward the mouths of the waiting terrors below. Chapter 23. Este leaned over him, dabbing salve onto his face. For the moment, Anset forgot everything bad and carefully said to her, "I didn't jump. They told me to jump and I didn't." She said nothing. She said nothing at all, and her silence was a blow that knocked him back in on himself. Anset's face was stiff when he awoke. He was not cold anymore. His head ached, and where the splinters had been driven into his face, the stinging was a constant undercurrent. But he felt something cool touching his face, and wherever it touched, the stinging went away. He opened his eyes just a little,